All right. Well, here we go. Well, again, welcome everybody. It is great to have you with us. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. Also with us today is Jessie Johnson, a biologist with the Vermont Agency of Transportation. She's going to take the second half of today's presentation on reconnecting the Green Mountains. So again, great to have you all with us. We're using Microsoft Teams. Thank you for your patience with this clunky program. Please know that we are recording this webinar, so you might want to turn your video off during the presentation. Please do keep your mics muted during the presentation, and know that we're going to use chat to communicate with you all. So we'll be dropping a few links in the chat as we go. To offer some background information, and go ahead and click on those and have them up in your browser, and then come back to the webinar, or you'll lose them. But we're also happy to send those out to you afterwards. But for now, if you go ahead and practice using the chat and just type in your name and what town you're from or what organization you're with, that would give us a sense of who's in the virtual room and introduce yourself to each other. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So also in the back end, forgive me, Dave, I didn't introduce you. Managing the back end of today's webinar is Dave Maroney. And Dave and I are both from Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And at the department, we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. That's a huge mission. It takes us in a lot of different directions. Dave and I staff the Community Wildlife Program, and so we offer technical assistance to Vermont municipalities. We are currently working with a couple of the towns on the webinar today, and it's great to have you all with us. But we do technical assistance, so we do presentations and workshops. We help with mapping. This is how we can be helpful in your town's work. So for today's presentation, we're going to divide things up into 4 different sections. And first, we're going to think about the larger ecological context of this area of the Green Mountains, really the junction of the northern Green Mountains and the central Green Mountains. And so we want to dive into that ecological context. And then we want to discuss the barriers to wildlife movement, I-89, Route 2, the railroad. And then we want to talk a little bit about land use planning in that region and see what towns are doing in terms of their land use and how the municipal piece ties into this larger area. And lastly, Jessie's going to take over and really dive into the transportation infrastructure that's present in this area, and also the opportunities with infrastructure to allow for wildlife movement. Many of you have been on our webinars before. You know that we'll take breaks about every 10 or 15 slides, and that's the time to ask questions. So feel free to write questions while we're going, Dave will read those questions from the chat when the time comes. All right, so I'd like to start by going on a hike. And so here we are in Bolton, and we're going to walk up to one of the overlooks near Bolton Dome to get a good view of this area. And so across the way, you can see the Camel's Hump block, and we're standing on the edge of the Mount Mansfield forest block. And in between, you can see I-89 and Route 2. So here's that same area just on the map. And so we're really focused on these towns of Bolton, Waterbury, and Duxbury. And, this area is so interesting because the chain of the Green Mountains really offers a ridge for wildlife movement with very few wildlife crossings. The Mount Mansfield block alone is 71,000 acres. The Camel's Hump block is 56,000 acres. And so you can see the acreages with in blue, we're seeing the habitat blocks, the forest blocks. And those are colored by size, with darker being bigger. And so you can see, again, 71,000 acres for that Mount Mansfield block, 56,000 acres for that Camel's Hump block. The Worcester Range that with the Putnam State Forest is 46,000 acres. So really, there's just a huge concentration, or there's a concentration of huge forest blocks in this region that is really unparalleled. And so there's this here in central Vermont. It's really the linchpin of a much larger network of connected habitat. Now, over the course of the presentation this morning, we're going to drill in and think about three different structures that Jesse is going to introduce: Pineo Brook, Sharkyville Underpass, and the Little River Wildlife Shelf. And so I want to talk about this larger context, but know that we're headed to talking about very specific structures within this much larger context. Now, Vermont has a conservation design, and you can see this on the BioFinder website. It is a statewide prioritization, and the places in dark green on this map are the most important lands and waters to maintain for ecological function. There are three words that we really rely on to help distill this, and those are intact, connected, and diverse. We need our ecological systems to be intact, whether we're talking about large forest blocks or the riparian network. Excuse me. These places also need to be connected to one another, and there needs to be a larger pattern across the landscape. A pattern of connected forests and waters is important to maintain biological diversity and to adapt to climate change. And then lastly, we need a diverse array of habitats and landscape settings. When we look at this region on BioFinder, and you can see the Vermont Conservation Design data, you begin to understand that this whole region of central Vermont is really considered highest priority at that statewide scale. And their highest priority because of their size as interior forest blocks, and also their location, that context. And here I really want to talk about habitat connectivity. So we can take this overall design, this dark green and light green prioritization, and explode it into its component parts. And that's going to help us figure out why a particular spot is called highest priority. And so the Mansfield block and the Camel's Hump block are both considered highest priority as interior forest and also as connectivity blocks. So connectivity, here in BioFinder, you can see that, that there's a selection of forest blocks that form this unbroken chain, north to south, east to west. And so this highest priority area in orange is really the backbone of connectivity. This is what allows for wildlife movement from the Berkshires to the Suttons in Quebec, from the Adirondacks to the White Mountains. These are the places in Vermont that add up to that much larger system of connected habitat, north, south, east, west. We can also think of this as something as a wildlife highway that's part of a larger network of wildlife movement. Now, our network of wildlife movement is huge, really. There are hundreds of local crossings across the state. And so these purple arrows don't begin to express the complexity of our network and just how many local crossings, local road crossings are super important to add up to this larger network. But I'm just trying to give you a sense of the backbone of the network. Vermont is really at the crossroads of wildlife connectivity throughout the entire ecoregion. And so here you're seeing the Staying Connected initiatives, eco-regionally significant linkage areas. So Staying Connected is a public-private partnership. It's binational, it's multi-state, multi-province. At the Northern Appalachian scale, it's more than 60 partners. And then there's a chapter that operates just within Vermont. And then there are groups that operate within each of the linkages. Look at those colored blobs, right? Those linkages. See how many of them are in Vermont. Vermont is really this crossroads of connectivity across the entire northern Appalachian, across this entire region. And so the forest, the connected pattern in Vermont, is adding up to something even bigger at this continental scale. Speaking of the continental scale, this is a work from the Nature Conservancy, and here's a model of some 2,000 mammals, birds, and amphibians, and how they are projected to move in response to climate change. Now, this is work done by Lawler et al. In 2015, and the Nature Conservancy estimates that entire populations are moving north and south away from the equator on average about a mile per year and about 36 feet upslope in elevation. And please notice how the Northeast is really this pinch point for this continental scale wildlife movement. So I'm talking about a network, an ecological context, right, where this area of the junction of the Central Greens and the North Greens is a linchpin for Central Vermont, and it's part of this larger backbone that extends across the entire state, and that in turn is an incredibly important crossroads for wildlife movement at the entire northern Appalachian scale. So I just wanted to put this place in a very much bigger context and help you understand just how important this location is. Dave, are there any early questions for me about that sort of ecological context?
No questions at the moment, Jens. Hi, folks. Dave Maroney here with the Community Wildlife Program. I just want to remind you that you can type questions as they come up into the chat. I'll be keeping track of them. I can read them out so Jens and Jesse can answer them live for you in today's presentation. I noticed we have a hand from one of the participants. So we have a moment here. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question, we have space for it. Since we have a nice small group today. That would be Wheezy.
Go ahead, Wheezy.
Well, we have another question that came in, Jens. So from Norma in the chat, is there a higher priority assigned to south to north crossing versus west to east?
No, there isn't. I mean, both are important, but the wildlife that are moving in response to climate change aren't just going north. Actually, if you go due north along the spine of the Greens, it sort of dead ends in agricultural lands in southern Quebec. So the actual path to continuous forested movement is a little bit more northeast. And so that east-west movement is every bit as important as that north-south movement. Even more than that, we have very high biological diversity in the Champlain Valley, and less so where we have the larger forest blocks along the spine of the Greens. So that east-west movement from the low elevation Champlain Valley to the higher elevation of the ridge of the Greens is also incredibly important.
Great, thank you, Jens. Let's move on for the time being. We're going to have another opportunity for break and questions. So feel free to put those questions in the chat, and Wheezy, we'd be happy to come back to your question when you're ready.
Awesome, thanks, Dave. So next up, I want to talk about the barrier. And so here we are on the side of I-89, right in Waterbury, just on the Bolton-Waterbury town line. And at the right, you see Route 2. And that Route 2 in this section carries about 5,000 cars every day. And then here we are on 89, and 89 carries 13,500 cars each day. And then please notice in the middle of I-89 is a Jersey barrier, that concrete barrier. And that is 4 feet tall. And that's really a significant barrier for small to medium and even large mammals. We have anecdotal reports of bear crossing 2 lanes of 89, seeing the Jersey barrier and turning around only to get hit on the return trip. Now, Farther to the left of this image, there's also a railroad. There's some development down in the valley. There's the Winooski River. There's River Road. So while the forest blocks, as I showed you earlier, the forest blocks are so close here. There's the opportunity is ripe, and yet the barriers in the middle are pretty significant. I just wanted to give you, I don't think you're hearing this. I forgot to enable sound for you all, but I just wanted to give you a sense of just how busy this section of road really is. It's really quite dramatic in terms of the sheer volume of cars. And so if you think about trying to find a gap between cars during the day, it's really quite a challenge. Obviously, there's a lot less traffic during the evening and at night in particular. And so there are opportunities to cross 89, but it's a tough business. Now, the barrier effect here actually goes back quite a ways to when Vermont was only 20% forested in the early 1900s. And at that time, Vermont's black bear populations retreated to high elevation refugia in the northern Green Mountains and in the Northeast Kingdom. And so Vermont's black bear population really exhibits surprising genetic structure around the subpopulations, considering how small Vermont is. And so the results are indicative of restrictions in gene flow. So what we're seeing here is what our bear biologist refers to as a linear sorting that occurred when the bear population was restricted. And yet today, the highway continues to limit genetic exchange. So to be clear, the highway did not cause these subpopulations to form, but the highway is reinforcing that pattern of maintaining separate genetic populations. So it's really interesting to me to understand, that the role that landscape history has played, and also the role that roads are playing today. So we have done work for years in this region to understand the barrier effect of I-89 and Route 2, to get a better handle on the amount of species diversity that are in the habitat blocks on both sides of 89, to understand more about the crossing that happens under or over 89 or not. So in 2014, the Agency of Transportation and the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department got together and worked with McFarland Johnson to do a study of this area. And here's the study area. And so in green is permanently conserved public land. The green dots are locations where we had game cameras, trail cameras set up. In red are transects, and so the consultants did winter tracking, where they walked basically between the two camera locations and looked for any tracks that crossed their transect, their path of travel, and were able to record a surprising amount of species diversity in these forest blocks on both sides. Now, the consultants also walked along the median of I-89 and walked along River Road to get a sense of that over-the-road movement. And there were cameras at several of the structures to try and capture any under-the-road movement. So here's some data, and I have highlighted those three structures that I introduced earlier: Pineo Brook, Sharkyville, and Little River. Now, Jesse's going to tell you a lot more about these, but for right now, I'll just say that there's really very limited movement using these three structures. Now, after this study, Little River has become the site of a wildlife shelf under I-89 that has actually been terrifically successful, and Jesse will tell you more about that. But pre-construction, there was some fox usage, some dog usage, but not that much. But then we were able to put in a wildlife shelf, and that side of the of this area of interest has a lot more passage than it used to. Look at that, Sharkyville, the structure in the middle. There was one mink that crossed through that structure once. And Pineo Brook will introduce as well, and you know that has had a little bit of movement, but not much. But the consultants did find that this structure between Pineo Brook and the Sharkyville Road, Sharkyville Brook, was the highest priority road segment in the area that they studied. And so they basically said, if you ever have heaps of cash and can appropriately size some of these structures, it would be a great investment in wildlife. Now, the consultants also found that there's a tremendous amount of wildlife movement parallel to the highway. And so at right, we can see, you know, there's this path game trail of deer moving beside the right-of-way fence, ostensibly looking for places to cross under or over the highway. This is a moose at above the Sharkyville culvert. Didn't even pause to look at the culvert because it's so small. But, you know, so there's a lot of movement parallel to the highway that we're seeing at this location. Now, we are seeing a tremendous amount of wildlife diversity in the forest blocks. At left, you can see all of our trail camera photos from what we call the Richardson Road remote. And so at right is the map. So it's in the big forest block to the south of Sharkyville and Little River. And really just about any mammal species you can imagine uses this vernal pool. We even have, we'll have a bat flying through here in a few minutes. But, you know, just incredible, the diversity of species that we see up in these forest blocks. So we're really confident that we've got good species diversity on both sides of the highway. Let me show you a little bit more. This one is from north of the highway. And so we have bear and deer. This is just upstream of the Little River. Here, a little closer to the highway. Excuse me, I'm still up at that higher one. We have some more photos of bear, coyote, fisher, moose, bobcat, just a tremendous diversity. And then here, a little closer to the highway, again, we're still getting bear and moose, and this is just about 1,000 meters up from Little River. So there's a tremendous barrier here. We know we've got great species diversity on both sides of the highway. We know that wildlife are moving parallel to the highway. The consultants estimated that about 1% of the total amount of movement they saw up in the habitat blocks actually is moving across I-89 and Route 2. So the amount of crossing under or over the highway pales in comparison to the amount of crossing that we're seeing up in the forest blocks on either side. So that was just a little bit more information about the barrier, and we're beginning to get a little bit more local in terms of looking at this location. What kind of questions have come up for folks so far?
Feel free to type your questions in the chat if you have them for Jens. We also, based on our time, could probably take a question or two live if folks have one. We've got one question coming in. If you'd like to use the raise hand icon, you're welcome to. We have one comment just to let you know, Jens. It's just amazing to see and hear all of this. Thank you, Penny.
Just wait, Penny. Jesse's got the big surprise for us.
Okay, Jens, we have a question from Norma. Can a corridor, meaning a wildlife corridor, be redesignated or reappointed?
Norma, I'm not exactly understanding what you mean by that.
Norma, do you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dave. So we're talking about reappointed or redesignated?
Yeah, redesignated or reappointed. Norma's typing a little more in the chat to clarify. But I might interpret that perhaps part of that question is understanding, do people decide whether something is a wildlife corridor, or is it does it exist based on its ecological foundations? So is it something that we can just say, here's a wildlife corridor? Norma's written, yeah, if something keeps yeah, not quite understanding that, Norma.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's kind of my interpretation.
Right on. So yes. So first of all, wildlife are determining where to cross, and mothers will teach their young the spot where they've always crossed. And so there is a lot of fidelity to certain wildlife crossing locations, and that have worked for animals over time, and that have been passed down from generation to generation. That's the spot to cross. So on one level, animals are making that determination. And then humans are responding to that. So we put up wildlife road crossing signs based on locations where there's high roadkill or high crossing rates. And so we're responding to that the presence of animals crossing at certain locations. But it's also true that as the landscape gets more and more developed, if we set something aside as a wildlife crossing and make it more suitable for wildlife movement, as the rest of the landscape gets more developed, that will see more usage. And so out west, when they put in new overpass or underpass, they estimate that it often takes some of the bigger animals 3 to 5 years to begin to use that new crossing. So it's a little bit of both, right? If we build it, they will come, is partially true. And it's also true that they've been crossing in certain locations for generations, and that's where they're going to cross. So it's a little bit of both.
Great, thank you. We have one hand raised icon. If you'd like to take yourself off mute and ask your question, go ahead.
I think that might be for me.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. I wasn't sure if it worked. Thank you, Jens. I had just a clarifying question about the consultants and how those animal tracks were determined. So were they actually just tracking the tracks, or were there cameras that they used to also verify the identity of the species they saw?
So both. We had 40 cameras deployed, and those were those green circles that I showed you. And so those were static locations for the camera traps, and those camera traps were used continuously for 2 years. And then actually a few of those locations we continue to monitor with those camera traps ever since. The transect data, they were hiking in the snow, and they field identified tracks in the snow that they encountered. And so, they're really excellent trackers. And so they were able to get to species on many of those tracks.
Okay, thank you so much. I missed the transect part. Thanks.
Yeah, all good. Okay. How are we doing, Dave?
We're good. Let's move on to the next section. Thanks,
all right,
folks, for your questions.
Yeah, please keep them coming. We do have time here, but okay, so I just wanted to talk in this next section, the last of my piece, a little bit more about land use planning. And as I said at the outset, Dave and I work with Community Wildlife Program. We're really focused on this municipal level. And so I just wanted to explore that a bit. If you look at, this is a map of permanently conserved lands in tan, the use value appraisal program in green, the locations of those 3 structures in purple. And so I just wanted to give you a sense that in this area, land managers, both state land managers and private land managers, have really maintained this area in a forested condition for quite a long time. And have been doing a great job of managing for forest products, but also for wildlife habitat. And so this whole area is really seeing great stewardship. And in the private lands, 83% of Vermont is in private land. And so these private land managers have really done a great job of maintaining this area to allow for wildlife connectivity. That may not have been their goal, but it's certainly what's happening in practice. And so you can see opportunity where these managed forests really line up north and south across from the highway. Now, at left is the town of Bolton, at right is the town of Waterbury. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about what Bolton has done over the years in this regard. So Bolton had a natural resource inventory done in 2012 as part of the Science to Action project. So it's a field-based inventory. So they learned a lot more about their landscape. And then in the years after that, I worked with the Conservation Commission a couple times, and they were really excited about aspects of connectivity. They did some hotspot mapping of road segments in Bolton that were important for wildlife movement. And then in 2019, a pretty awesome volunteer, Deb Shelby, took over as chair of the Planning Commission. And the first town plan that she worked on, she did some really tremendous outreach to get people involved in that effort. And so first they had a pizza party as part of their town plan outreach. And they got, I think, 40 or 50 people to attend this. And they broke them up into 4 different groups by neighborhood and really checked in. Then the town put on an art contest, the Spirit of Bolton art contest. And here are 2 of the winners of that. Julie Longstreth painted boulders and bears at left. And then you can see one of the youth winners at right. Bolton streams are awesome. Bolton, its motto, by the way, is the land of boulders and bears. And so that's the inspiration for Julie's painting. And so, this public process as part of the town plan really showed how important this rural character was to the town, how important wildlife was to the town. And meanwhile, the Conservation Commission was getting really interested in this concept of north-south connectivity. Now, the old zoning that was in effect at that time in Bolton really allowed for sprawling development east-west, parallel to the highway. You can see here in this map, I'll just turn on my pointer. Here is their conservation district, here is their forestry district, and this is a rural residential district. And we know that the vast majority of growth in Vermont happens in these rural residential districts, and regrettably, it happens as sprawl. Ex-urban sprawl. And so zoning like this really encourages sprawling development in those ag-rural residential districts. We really don't get development in our village centers the way we want to. Often that's because of septic capacity. So at the time, Bolton had a pretty big rural residential district. So then after the town plan work, Deb and the Planning Commission began to work on their zoning, and they updated their zoning. Now, Bolton is the home of the Bolton Valley Resort and has seen a number of Act 250 proceedings over the years that have limited development, put deed restrictions in place to limit development. So a lot of the expansion of the conservation district that you see here is actually just the Planning Commission admitting this area will never be developed anyway because they're deed restrictions. So let's just call it part of our conservation district because that's really what it is. So this isn't as dramatic of a change as it looked, but they did redraw the district boundaries to go to extend farther south and to cut across what was that rural, ag-rural residential district and meet up with their fluvial hazard overlay down by the river and the highway. So they expanded their district boundaries. They just redrew their district boundaries. They didn't put in an overlay. They expanded their district boundaries. they expanded the conservation district and the forestry districts and had brought those down to the highway. Now, note this one that I was just highlighting, it happens to line up with transportation infrastructure. And so they designed their zoning to limit development in a north-south way, a north-south pattern that lines up with existing transportation infrastructure. Now, this culvert isn't the best in the world in terms of moving wildlife. It has its problems. It's repelling some animals, but there is opportunity there because the land use is in place to limit development. And when this structure fails in 20, 30 years, there's incredible opportunity to appropriately size it and to line up with that existing zoning to the north. And then to the south is permanently conserved land on the Duxbury side of the river. So really, Bolton zoning was just a tremendous step forward in terms of allowing for habitat connectivity. I believe Dave has put a story map in the chat for you that really tells the story of how Bolton was able to accomplish this. Now, on the just to the east is the town of Waterbury, and I just wanted to show you that here on the north side of the river, this area is a conservation district for the town of Waterbury, and then we have a significant amount of permanently conserved land up here. And so there on the Waterbury side, there's a great deal of protection, both in land use and in terms of permanent protection, north of the highway. In Waterbury, what that means, their conservation district actually has single-family homes as a permitted use rather than a conditional use, and that's a 10-acre minimum lot. So there's room for improvement here for sure in terms of zoning protections, but I did really want to underscore just how much work has happened in this land use planning sphere. Okay, that's it for my section. Questions, comments, thoughts for me as Jessie is changing over to her screen.
Well, it's a fresh slate, so we can take any questions you have for Jens from any of the components of the presentation thus far. No pressure, but we'll take a minute here just to open up that space for you to ask the questions that you have.
All right. Jessie, we are seeing your screen and you're good to go.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm going to be presenting on the transportation infrastructure part of this presentation here. So we're going to look a little bit more into those structures and how they relate to transportation and wildlife. So here's just a map of where our structures are. So the first one that we're going to focus on is Pimeo Brook. And then the next structure we're going to look at is the Little River Wildlife Shelf. And then we are going to look at the Sharkyville Underpass. So let's look at Pimeo Brook first. This structure currently has 47% bank full width. Right now at VTrans, we want all of our structures to be 1 times bank full width. So this is not sufficient for us as well. And if we think back to that McFarland-Johnson study, there was a lot of active avoidance of this structure by wildlife here. During the going out and looking at tracks portion of that study, only 9 sets of tracks were recorded going through this structure, and there was a lot of active avoidance by hooved mammals such as deer that were believed to have crossed at the Little River location and not here. Additionally, this area is the farthest to the west of this this corridor for wildlife here. This area wasn't chosen for a potential wildlife crossing because of its proximity to the railroad. So if we were to go and make this structure a lot better for wildlife, we wouldn't just have to deal with, adjoining landowners and transportation. We'd also have to deal with the railroad, which makes this a lot trickier of a spot. However, at reiterating what Jens had said, when the structure is in time to be replaced, we are going to hopefully replace it with something that's a lot better for wildlife here. Okay, the next location is the Little River Wildlife Shelf. So this is the underside of 3 bridges, I-89 northbound, southbound, and US Route 2, which all travel over this little river here. And as you can see, there's a lot of riprap in this area before it was made better for wildlife here. And this riprap, I don't know if you guys have ever tried to walk on riprap, but it's not super fun. It's a little bit difficult to traverse. And if you think, it's difficult to move through in shoes, just think about how difficult it is to move on this with hooves. So it's very difficult for wildlife to be able to move on this structure. So there's a lot of avoidance here. So we actually had a project on US Route 2 that left us with a lot of surplus material that needed to be disposed of. So the material was actually disposed of on top of the riprap here, and created a wildlife shelf in this area. So we were able to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And you can see that this area is now naturally vegetated, and, provides habitat for pollinators and other things, while also is very welcoming to a lot of wildlife. So this has allowed a lot more movement underneath the structure. So here we have a deer moving right underneath our structure here, right after construction happened in 2014. And you can see that there's still, that netting down. So this was like directly after construction, which is really, really cool that we're getting movement so quickly. And then these photos are also from the cameras all at this location here. So you can see more deer in these photos. There's a bobcat, a fox, and a moose that all can use this structure to be able to move along this corridor here. It's also important to note that this is on the farthest east side of our wildlife corridor that we have. So it would be really great to have a structure in between our Little River location and the Pimeo Brook location for wildlife to be able to move in. That should be able to catch a lot of the wildlife moving through this area. So that brings us to the Sharkyville Culvert. I have 3 photos here, the upstream and downstream inlet. If you see the upstream inlet, it's very, very small. And you can see that it's very constricted as well. Currently, it's only 22% bankfull width, and there is no wildlife passage available in here. Jens had mentioned earlier, we have had just 1 mink traveling through this. Nothing else has ever gone through this structure. It's really, really long and very dark. I don't particularly want to crawl through it, and I don't think anything else does either. And if you look at the picture of the downstream outlet, you can see that this area is perched, and there's huge scour hole in this area. So during flooding events, water just comes shooting out of this hole. So not only does the structure need to be replaced in terms of hydraulics, but this is actually the perfect location to be able to put in a wildlife crossing here. The third picture here is a picture of a moose that walked past the culvert. There is a lot of wildlife movement through this area, and on the upstream inlet side, there's actually a path moving right past the inlet of the culvert for wildlife moving alongside the highway, being able to look for a spot to cross that's safe. And so we know that this area is a barrier for wildlife movement. So being able to put in a structurally sufficient structure would be fantastic here. So we actually applied for the IIJA grant here, and we were able to secure 2.1 million for the development of plans for this project, and that was developed by McFarland Johnson, and they were able to write up a nice little grant proposal for us. And now we're able to, get those designs that are being constructed by Hoyle Tanner. In addition to that, we also have active monitoring going on at the site. Active monitoring is not new to this location. Cameras have been here since the first McFarland Johnson study, but now we are adding thermal image cameras. These have been put in here by Hoyle Tanner to monitor this location. So you can see this little fawn here taking a drink of water from the stream, and then here comes the mother coming in here. In addition to thermal imaging, we are also putting and conducting roadkill surveys, which I'm actually going to do this afternoon, to be able to find where wildlife are getting hit along this corridor, which I think is very important for this as well. So here is a plan view of the Sharkyville culvert in its current state. So if you see these contour lines, you can tell that there's an upslope and a downslope on the other side, either side of US Route 2 and I-89, and the culvert goes underneath all of it. So it's actually 385 feet long. So it's very dark, very small, and nothing's getting through it, and it has around 40 to 60 feet of fill on top of it. And then this is the current culvert, and this is what we are likely going to put in. These plans that I'm showing you were designed in-house by VTrans and are just conceptual. The actual plans for this project are being designed by Hoyle Tanner actively, so we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like. But you can tell that the new structure that we're putting in is a lot wider and a lot bigger, and it's going to have much larger opening, which is going to allow wildlife to feel more comfortable to move through the structure. It's also going to be a lot more hydraulically sufficient as well, and it's only going to be around 200 feet long because we're cutting out a lot of that fill that's holding together that culvert location. So this is the mock-up of what this structure is going to look like. And if you look at the front here, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there is a 2-scale moose in this mock-up so that you can really gauge how large this structure is going to be. So we have also applied for another proposal for construction cost. So hopefully we can, get that approved and be able to and get this built. And that is what I have here today. So I can stop sharing.